Today we're going to be going over section 3 of chapter 11. So I do want to remind you that you will not be tested on anything from chapter 11 besides this third section on sexual motivation. So the motivational concepts, the hunger, and the affiliation and achievement sections you will not be tested on at all, just on the sexual section. And then we're also going to go over the first half of chapter 12, which is something like 2 or 3 times the normal size of a chapter in your textbooks. Chapter 12 is really long. I'm going to try to stick to kind of just the main points and let you just read through the rest of the bullet points on the PowerPoint on your own. So I'll try to keep things as short and sweet as I can, but just know that chapter 12 is very, very long. So we'll get through as much as we can, as quickly as we can. As always with these warm-ups, you should be doing them on your own on that worksheet before you try to watch the video and get the solutions. But like I said, because this information is in the past PowerPoint and you can go back and watch the chapter 10 PowerPoint, I'm not going to explain these answers, but you can always shoot me an email if you have a question about these warm-up answers. So I'll just leave these here for a second. Like I said, I'll post the PowerPoint slides so you'll be able to access this, or you can just pause the video and read through. All right, so getting started, I'm sure that we've all heard of testosterone and estrogen, and typically we think of testosterone as the male hormone and estrogen as the female hormone, but one thing that's really important, and I want you to write this down, number 1, is that both females and males have both testosterone and estrogen. It's not that only males have testosterone and only females have estrogen. Both sexes have both. Write that down. Both sexes have both hormones. Both sexes have both hormones. But men do have more testosterone than women, and they have more testosterone than they have estrogen. And then vice versa for women. Women have more estrogen than they have testosterone, and of course much more estrogen than men are going to have. But just know that they're sex hormones, and know that both sexes have both. Okay, as far as the sexual response cycle, there's really not too much that you're going to need to know here. I would just memorize the order of these. So know that it's excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. There's kind of a chart here that I put that I think is cool. It just shows arousal versus time. So in the excitement stage, you see that like arousal is increasing. In the plateau stage, arousal is higher than 0, right? It's pretty high, but it's staying constant right there. It's staying flat. And then orgasm is where we reach peak arousal. And then in the resolution phase, we fall back down to level 0 of arousal. And then you should also know this term refractory period. We talk about that in chapter 2 as it pertains to neurons. When a neuron has all neurons have a refractory period. And that is just a pause between one firing of the neuron and the next firing. It can't fire 2 times in a row too quickly. There's got to be a resting period. And so that's the same concept here in terms of sex. So a refractory period in terms of human sexuality is once a man has an orgasm, there's a certain amount of time that has to pass before he's able to have another orgasm. They can't happen back to back. That's not true for females though. Females do not have a refractory period. They can experience orgasm back to back. So we're going to talk about all sorts of fun things in this chapter. So I guess I'm kind of glad that I'm doing this virtually, because if I was in person, I'd probably be very red by the end of this. But the first thing that we're going to talk about is the difference between a sexual dysfunction and a paraphilia. So a sexual dysfunction is a problem that you have that prevents you from getting through the sexual response cycle. So getting through from excitement to plateau to orgasm to resolution. And so this could come out as erectile disorder for a man. So that would be a problem in the excitement stage. He can't get excited, get an erection. For females, it could be female orgasmic disorder. Females are sometimes not able to achieve orgasm. So a sexual dysfunction just means that at some point in the natural process of what happens in a sexual encounter, your response is not typical. You have some kind of issue with functioning at a point in the cycle. Whereas a paraphilia refers to some kind of sexual arousal towards something that is more than just atypical, but kind of strange, like fantasies about non-human objects, the suffering of yourself or others, non-consenting persons. So paraphilia really has to do with sort of disordered thinking about sex and disordered sexual behavior, whereas sexual dysfunction is, well, this is a physical issue that we should deal with and treat so that you can have a normal sexual experience, whereas a paraphilia is, oh no, this is an issue where we may need some psychological help. And anything that ends in like ilia is a paraphilia. So pedophilia, necrophilia, things like that. And then the APA classifies a sexual behavior as disordered if it meets one of two criteria. And those are a person experiences distress from their sexual interest, or it entails harm or risk of harm to others. That's not like a perfect categorization, but those are the criteria that we've come up with to determine what's disordered sexual behavior and what's not. Okay. This is just a small section on sexually transmitted diseases or infections. Condoms are 80% effective in preventing the spread of HIV. That's really important. So, be careful in your sexual encounters should you have them. Always use protection, right? Keep yourself safe. And AIDS, of course, is that immune deficiency syndrome that it starts out as HIV and then can develop into full-blown AIDS, and that will deplete your immune system, leave you vulnerable to infections, and eventually will likely kill you. Okay, exposure to sexually explicit material. So what we're talking about here is pornography. There are some adverse effects to watching pornography. There's 3 specific things that are mentioned in the textbook, and so the first one is going to be believing rape is acceptable. And I do want to caveat that and say it is only a very small percentage of pornographic material that depicts rape or anything non-consensual. It's not the majority. So you would have to be, essentially looking to access that small subset for this to really be a problem. But nonetheless, if you are watching pornography that includes non-consensual behavior, then that of course can lead you to believe that rape is more acceptable than that it's acceptable at all. Obviously it's not. The next one would be reduced satisfaction with a partner's appearance or with a relationship. And this is really just because, porn can give you unrealistic expectations. It's glamorized, it's false. It doesn't give you really a realistic expectation of what sex would be like. And then desensitization. And so the example I'd like to use for this is non-sexual. Hooray. If you're with your partner and they say that they love you for the first time, imagine like how good that feels, that like intensity when someone says that they love you for the first time. But if you've been with someone, for a few months and it's like the 107th time that they're saying I love you, yeah, it still means something, of course, but you don't feel it as intensely. And that's what desensitization speaks to. The more that we're exposed to something, the less intense we think about it or feel about it. It just becomes sort of our new normal. And so for people who are watching a lot of pornography, this can desensitize them to sex and actually make sex less pleasurable for them. Okay. I'm just going to give a real quick summary on this. So this is just about what sorts of factors contribute to teens having sex, and particularly whether that sex is protected or unprotected, and also whether or not that will lead to pregnancy. So as it pertains to birth control, if teens talk openly with their parents and their partner, then they're more likely to use contraceptives, and that will prevent pregnancy. Impulsivity, 72% of sexually active 12 to 17-year-olds said they regretted having had sex. And of course, unplanned or impulsive sex can lead to an unplanned pregnancy if you're not using protection. Alcohol use, a lot of hookups occur after alcohol use, and when people are drinking, they're less likely to use condoms because their judgment is impaired and their risk assessment is poor. And then mass media, the more that we show sexual interactions being normal through the media, the more that people feel sort of pressured to engage in sex because they feel that they're not normal if they're not. Because if the media is showing that everyone, who's in high school or college is having sex, then I must be, different if I'm not. Okay. So then we're going to get into sexual orientation, and particularly we're going to talk a lot about homosexuality in this section. And I know that can be controversial for some people. I think it's getting less controversial over time, but Dr. Lawrence has had some students actually come at her before and say that she was going to hell for teaching this material. So I just want to caveat that this is not about your opinions about whether or not homosexuality is right or wrong. It's all about just the science of how someone might become homosexual, and I mean that's mostly genetic, we're going to realize, or what sorts of factors contribute to increased rates of homosexuality versus decreased rates in different cultures and things like this. So it's all coming from a scientific research standpoint. I'm not making any types of claims about whether it's right or wrong or anything like that. We're going to stick to just the research, although I'm pretty certain that you all can probably tell what side I stand on that issue. But nonetheless, we're not going to get into that. So sexual orientation is just the orientation or the direction of your sexual attraction to what gender or sex, I suppose, or multiple gender sexes are you attracted. So we also have asexual. And so asexual, anytime you put the letter A before something, it's basically like a negation of what that is. So this is the absence of sexual attraction. We do not have sexual attraction to others if you're asexual. However, asexual people can still want to be in romantic relationships with others. It's just that what they crave is sort of the emotional connection, not the sexual part. But asexual people, can still have very fulfilling relationships with partners. And oftentimes someone who is asexual, if they're with a partner who's not asexual, their partner does engage in sexual activity and wants to, then often an asexual person will still have sex with their partner just to kind of please them. But just know that someone who's asexual doesn't have a sexual attraction to others. That doesn't necessarily mean that they won't engage in sex, but they don't feel sexual urges, essentially, to other people. Okay, write this down. I guarantee you this is going to be on the test. This has been on the test for semesters and semesters and semesters. 3 to 4% of men are homosexual and 1 to 2% of women. The test question will say blank percent of men and blank percent of women are homosexual, and your answer is going to be 3 to 4, and then we'll semicolon 1 to 2. So write that down. 3 to 4% of men, 1 to 2% of women are homosexual. Okay. And then a little more information from this section. People are more likely to hide their sexual orientation in places that aren't tolerant, but they are no more or less likely to be homosexual. So it's all about whether or not people feel comfortable to express their sexuality, but all throughout the world, no matter what country, culture, whatever, we see the same rates approximately of homosexuality in men and women. Some individuals struggle with their sexual attractions, especially during adolescence, and if they feel as though they are or will be rejected by their parents or peers. So I want to touch on kind of when we were talking about disordered behavior, like the APA, what they classify as disordered behavior, they say that a disordered sexual behavior has to cause the person distress. So they have distress from the sexual interest from the strange sexual interest that they have, or it entails harm to others. So with that definition, homosexuality is certainly not considered to be a disordered sexual behavior, because where the distress comes from is from social rejection. The distress does not come from their sexual orientation. People don't struggle with the fact that they're attracted to a certain sex. What they struggle with is whether or not they're going to be accepted for who they are and for their sexual orientation being what it is. So What brings them distress is the treatment of others. It's not their sexual interest. Without social support, non-heterosexual teens are likely to have lower self-esteem and to develop anxiety and depression, an increased risk of contemplating suicide. I want to say something about this too. So people will sometimes say that homosexuality is correlated with mental disorders like anxiety and depression, therefore homosexuality must be a mental illness issue too. And I want to clarify that that's not true. Remember that correlation is not causation, right? So there is a correlation between homosexuality and instance of mental disorders. However, we found a third variable. So homosexuals who receive support and acceptance from friends and family members have no higher of a rate of developing mental disorders. It is only homosexuals who are ridiculed, ostracized, or rejected by friends and family for who they are that experience higher rates of mental disorders. So those mental disorders correlate with the way that you're treated and whether or not you feel accepted for who you are. They do not correlate with your sexual orientation, though. People cannot force their sexual orientation to change or ignore or deny their sexual orientation. It's not willfully chosen. It's not willfully changed. We have never had success with things like conversion therapy. There is no way to change a person's sexual orientation. We've not discovered one. And then sexual orientation, this is kind of a funny way of saying this, but is especially persistent for men, whereas women's sexual orientation tends to be more fluid. And really what that's communicating is just that women are a little more open to having somewhat sexual encounters with other women than men are. Well, straight women and straight men, I mean. So a straight woman might be willing to kiss another straight woman, but it's rare to see like a straight man who's willing to kiss another straight man. So there's just some evidence that shows that women's sexual orientation can be a little more fluid. Even if they would only pick a man as a partner, they can still become aroused by females or things like that. Whereas men, it's not really like that. It's more black and white. You are straight or you're gay, or, you know, of course there's bi and all sorts of other options and stuff too. But it's more black and white for men, whereas for women, it can be more fluid. Okay, I'm going to make this real quick. These are just some questions we've tried to investigate. Is homosexuality linked with problematic relationships with parents? No. Does homosexuality involve a fear or hatred of people of the other sex, so people become attracted to their own sex? No. Is it linked with sex hormone levels currently in the blood? No. And as children, were most homosexuals molested, seduced, or otherwise victimized sexually? No. So these were all questions that we thought, oh, maybe this is a reason for why people are homosexual. But of course, through research, we found no, none of these things are true reasons. So nothing there. Okay. So this is kind of interesting. Same-sex sexual behaviors have been observed in several hundred other species. Particularly, I know that we've seen them in giraffes, dolphins, lions, rams and sheep, monkeys, birds. In fact, a fifth of swans are homosexual. That's interesting. And then seahorses, of course, because they're all male, so they have to be homosexual. But yeah, so we've seen same-sex attraction across the board in all sorts of species and animals. It's not something that's restricted to humans, which is evidence, of course, that it's not some kind of mental illness, because if animals have it too, it's, you know, it's different thing. It's common to almost every species. Every species we've really studied in depth, we've observed homosexual behavior. And sometimes animals that are typically heterosexual will still mate homosexually. So like there was a pair of penguins at this one really famous zoo. I don't remember which one it was, but at some national zoo, there was a pair of male penguins that actually mated for life. And it came to be birthing season. And of course they were two males, so they didn't have an egg to birth. And one of the penguins actually picked up a rock and carried it around just like an egg, just like all the other penguins were. And the people at the zoo felt so bad that they went and they got a baby penguin and they gave it to the gay couple so that they could also have their little penguin baby. Kind of cute. As it pertains to brain differences, know this is super important, that there's a cell cluster in the hypothalamus that is reliably, remember reliability has to do with consistency, so with the more and more people that we bring in and look at their brains, we see that it is reliably larger in heterosexuals and reliably smaller in homosexuals, that part of the hypothalamus. And then gay men tend to appear more female typical in their brain pattern responses, and lesbians appear more male typical. So, this is kind of has to do with the idea of gender being somewhat on a spectrum, right? Genetic influences. A third of variation in sexual orientation is attributable to genetics. So we think at least 33% of homosexuality is genetically determined. That doesn't necessarily mean that 66% of it, like 2/3, is due to the environment. It's not that clear. So when you're doing statistical analyses and stuff, and you're looking for what we call a measure of variation, you're looking to see, or variance rather, you're looking to see how much responsibility any one variable has for the outcome. And that it's not going to come down to just two variables, like just genes and just environment. There's a lot of specifics in there. So just understand that we have found that at least a third of variation is due to genetic influences, but we don't know about the other 2/3. It's not to say that it's all environmental. It's difficult. And I mean, these statistical analyses are kind of guesses more than they are like really fact, But identical twins are somewhat more likely in fraternal twins to be homosexual. Epigenetic marks distinguish gay and straight identical twins, and sexual orientation links with areas of 2 chromosomes, so that's just more evidence that it is genetic. Okay, prenatal influences. I'm going to have you write something down here in just a moment. But so this is kind of worded funny, but basically when you have a male fetus that you're pregnant with versus a female fetus, the prenatal environment is different for what sex you're about to birth. So if for whatever reason a male fetus is experiencing a prenatal environment that would be typical of a female fetus, then that actually can predispose that male fetus to be attracted to males in later life. So we've seen that the hormone levels that are typically experienced by female fetuses appear to predispose the person to be attracted to males in later life. So it predisposes females to be attracted to males, but also predisposes male fetuses who happen to receive the female fetus environment to also be attracted to males later in life. And then men with older brothers are somewhat more likely to be gay than men without older brothers. These odds increase with each subsequent male that's born. So next to this, I want you to write down fraternal birth order effect. That is what that's called, the fraternal birth order effect. And so the theory here, I'll try to make it as quick as I can. The theory here really is just that with each pregnancy that a woman has that is a male fetus, we've seen levels of antibodies go down. And so throughout time, with the more male pregnancies that you have, the lower and lower your levels of antibodies are with each subsequent pregnancy. And we think that there's some correlation with the amount of antibodies present and the sexual orientation of the child, which is why with each son that you have, it becomes more and more likely that the next son might be gay. But again, it's not consistent. It's not like every 5th son that's born is gay. It's not like that. There's so much variation in this. There's not a hard and fast rule that will tell you whether someone will be gay or straight. Okay. Some trait differences. Gay males tend to be shorter and lighter than straight males, while lesbian females tend to be heavier than straight females. Gay men's spatial abilities more closely represent those of straight females than straight males. Both straight women and gay men outperform straight men at remembering object spatial locations. So basically the main point of this is just that in general, and this isn't true across the board, but in general, we've seen some trends that suggest that gay men Their brain patterns are more female typical, and their actions and their interests and their activities are more female typical. And then lesbian women tend to have more male typical tendencies. But like I said, that's not a hard and fast rule. And then there are just some other traits that I've listed here, but it's just, I don't feel like I need to just read through the list or anything. So. Okay, well, that was activity 1. Very short, only one section of a chapter, but make sure that you know that section inside and out. You will have a lot of questions relating to sexual orientation on this test, I would project. So, moving on then to chapter 12. Okay, so emotions are a mix of 3 things. Number 1, arousal of your body, and that can come across as a pounding heart or sweating, just some kind of, my cat just jumped up and hit all my things. Just some type of physical arousal. Your body is changing in some type of way. And then an expressive behavior, so your reaction to something. And then your conscious experience and the way that you feel about something. Those are the 3 components of emotions. Okay. 2 primary questions. They are, does your bodily arousal come before or after your emotional feelings? And then how do thinking and feeling interact? Cognition and emotion. Okay, it's definitely important that you know the difference between James Lange, Cannon-Bard, and the 2-factor theory. Those 3 are crucial to know the differences between, and hopefully we can clear that up. But for James Lange theory versus Cannon-Bard theory, at least, the most important difference is that for James Lange, he's saying that your physiological arousal happens first and then you experience emotion. So one happens before the other. Whereas Cannon-Bard says, no, our physiological response and our experience of emotion happen at the same time. So you definitely want to know the difference there. My mnemonic for that is for James Lange, JL, I think it's the same as Cannon-Bard, just later. James Lange, just later, right? The experience of emotion just happens later, after the physiological response, whereas Cannon-Bard says they happen at the same time, simultaneously. And then we've got the 2-factor theory, and this really just says you need 2 things to get to the experience of emotion, and that's physiological arousal, and then it adds in this cognitive label. So we have to actually label what that arousal is. And this gives a lot of evidence to what we call misattribution of arousal, but it's just this idea that you can have the same physiological arousal for 2 very different emotions. My heart could be racing because I'm scared, or my heart could be racing because I'm excited, right? Those are 2 very different emotions, but it's the same physiological response. It just has to do with that second part, that cognitive label. Am I going to label that as being scared, or am I going to label it as being excited? Well, that's going to depend on the context that I'm in. If something has just jumped out at me, obviously I'm not excited, I'm scared, but if I've just received good news, well, then I'm excited, I'm not scared, right? And so here's a little chart that I think really helps to kind of show how to tell these apart, especially because Schachter-Singer, the 2-factor theory, and Cannon-Bard can be hard for people. So for James Lange, like I said, number 1, the arousal comes first and then the emotion follows. So we get emotion, but just later than with Cannon-Bard, right? For Cannon-Bard, the arousal and the emotion happen at the same time. So you experience fear at the same moment that your heart starts to pound because you're fearful, right? And then the 2-factor theory adds in this cognitive label. So we experience arousal and interpret that arousal, and then we experience emotion after we've decided what that arousal means, essentially. So if you hear like a twig snap behind you, for example, you might have some kind of arousal, like a pounding heart because of that. And so you turn around and you look, and if there's nothing there that's scary, then your emotion is it kind of goes back to just flat or normal. You're like, oh, thank God it was just the wind or whatever. Well, not the wind snapping a twig, but, something fell or whatever, small animal. Nothing that's going to injure me or be a threat to me. But if you turn around and there's a bear behind you, well, now you're going to experience fear, right? Because you put a cognitive label on your arousal. Okay. Don't worry too much about these last ones, Ch11 and Lazarus and all that, but I'll just kind of give you a summary on what they're talking about. So Ch11 said we have many emotional reactions apart from or before our conscious interpretation. So we might like someone right away without really knowing why. So he's saying cognition really isn't necessary for emotion. That's what Ch11 is trying to purport. Let me see what else is really important on here. Okay, I would know about this whole high and low road distinction. So for the high road, this is when we have very complex feelings like hatred and love. This is going to travel from the thalamus to the cortex and then to the amygdala. But for really simple emotions, likes and dislikes, fears, it's going to skip over the cortex and it's just going to go from the thalamus straight to the amygdala. So just know those two pathways, and really as long as you know the start and end point, the only thing you really have to know is just that the brain's cortex is involved with complex emotions, but we bypass that for easier emotions. But we can see that our feelings hijack our thinking more often than our thinking rules our feelings. Some emotional responses don't require conscious thinking. And so Ch11 was just saying, the two-factor theory isn't really correct because your cognitive appraisal of something doesn't always matter when it comes to emotion. Okay. So, summary of emotion theories. Like I said, really just know that for James Lang, it's arousal and then emotion, one before the other. Cannon-Bard, arousal and emotion happen at the same time. Two-factor theory, arousal and a cognitive label happen together, and then we get emotion. Ch11 was saying, we don't need conscious appraisal necessarily to feel emotion. And then Lazarus was kind of just talking about cognitive appraisal defining emotion. So he was kind of going against Ch11 and saying, well, no, cognitive appraisal is kind of the basis of emotion. If in fact you heard something behind you and that sound was just the wind, that's going to hugely impact your emotional response versus if you turned around and saw a real threat. So really the difference there is Ch11 says conscious appraisal or cognitive labels, whatever, aren't important. And Lazarus says, no, your cognitive appraisal is super important. In fact, it's the basis of emotion. Okay. So when it comes to emotion and also kind of stress, the sympathetic nervous system is going to be aroused when you have a fight or flight response, and your adrenal glands are going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine when your sympathetic nervous system is active. So make sure that you know what hormones are released by the sympathetic nervous system when stressed or when in a fight or flight situation, and know that those come from the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are what release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then the parasympathetic division, this is your rest and digest, right? This is what calms you down after a threat has passed. So it's going to soak up all of that epinephrine and norepinephrine that the sympathetic system released and take it out of the bloodstream. Okay. Physiology of emotions. Discerning physiological differences between fear, anger, and sexual arousal is difficult because they are sometimes expressed in similar ways. So this is kind of like I said, how a pounding heart could be that you're scared or that you're excited. So sometimes we have the same physiological response, but for different emotions. And then we have one brain region that could be considered the center of many different emotions, and that's the insula. And it's mostly activated in response to negative emotions. Note that the insula is linked to negative emotions. So things like lust, pride, and disgust, not positive emotions like, love or ambivalence or something like that. Like I said, sometimes physiological arousal is similar, but the expression is different. Fear and joy both increase heart rate, but facial expressions are very different. Okay. As far as detecting emotions in others, we're pretty good at detecting subtle expressions, so even kind of micro expressions, we're pretty good at detecting. experience can sensitize us to particular emotions. So for children who've been abused, they are way more likely to detect signs of anger before other people do, because they've had to, throughout their life be conscious of when someone was angry and might be a threat to them. So it all kind of comes, this is really another evolutionary take, I guess, another evolutionarily adaptive mechanism, where if it's a threat to you, it becomes something that you'll notice much more quickly and be more attuned to. Your facial muscles may reveal emotions that you try to hide. That's called micro-expressions. Write that down, micro-expressions. And basically, that's just an involuntary facial twitch. So it's most commonly seen with disgust reactions. Those have the most discernible micro-expression twitch. But, if you feel sad or mad or disgusted by something, certainly you can try to hide that emotion. But right when you first feel it, your face is going to change. You're going to have at least a few muscle twitches that correspond to areas that would show a face of sadness or anger or disgust. So even if you try to hide it, your facial muscles are going to activate to some degree before you're able to. We do find it difficult, though, to discern when people are lying. The behavioral differences between liars and truth tellers are too minute for people to detect usually. And introverts tend to be better at reading emotions. Extroverts tend to be more easily readable. So introverts, they are hard to read. It's difficult for people to tell the emotions that introverts are feeling, but they are very attuned to picking up emotions in other people. Whereas extroverts are very expressive of their emotions, but they have a hard time recognizing emotions in other people. Okay, there's kind of a lot of things just being cataloged here, but how do the genders differ in their ability to communicate non-verbally? Women are generally better at men in reading emotional cues. Women also have a greater sensitivity to nonverbal cues, and they're more, emotionally literate is really just speaking on emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence. So women tend to have more emotional intelligence than men. And men tend to describe simpler emotional reactions than women. I think this is interesting. So men would be likely to just say that they're mad or they're angry. Very simple, clear emotion, not complex. Whereas women would be more likely to say, well, I'm frustrated, I'm irritated, I'm annoyed, right? So kind of more nuanced, specific feelings. Whereas men are just sort of the general mad, sad, whatever. And then women, because they're better at detecting others' emotions, that may contribute to the fact that they're more emotionally responsive and expressive. But of course, that could also just be a cultural element, because women have been sort of taught to be nurturing. Maybe that's just why they are the way they are. And then I think this is interesting. If I were to read you a description of an angry person, most people are going to picture that person to be male. So when you're asked to think of an angry person, most people imagine a man. When you're shown an angry gender-neutral face, so usually that's just some kind of CGI that doesn't have any hair or anything, and it's, not really clearly masculine or feminine. But when that face is shown as being angry, people are likely to perceive it as a man. But if that same face was shown as smiling, people are more likely to perceive it as a female. The exact same face, the only thing that's changing is the expression. But we tend to associate, this is the main point, we tend to associate anger and hostility with men and sort of kindness and happiness with women. And then women are more likely than men to describe themselves as empathetic. But what we see that's interesting is when it comes to physical measures. So when we actually hook people up to things that measure their heart rate or their electrical conductivity of their skin or their respiration rate or something like that, we do see that basically the physical measures of empathy are essentially the same between men and women. However, women are more likely to express empathy, to display that emotion when they see someone else. So, when a woman is around someone who's crying, she's more likely to change her face so that she also sort of mimics that sadness, whereas men do not really express empathy as much. And then women tend to experience emotional events more deeply, and they have more brain activation in areas sensitive to emotion. So there is some evidence that, emotional intensity is higher for women than men. Okay. One thing that I want you to write down here under E1 about facial expressions and all that is that facial expressions are universal. Universal. Meaning that they are common across cultures. A smile always communicates happiness. A frown always communicates, sadness. It's not like in some culture in the world, people smile when they're sad and frown when they're happy. That's not how it is. So they're universal. They're common to all cultures. However, gestures and their meanings vary. So in America, we'll do like the okay sign or like hang loose or something like that. And those are actually seen as like signs of disrespect in other cultures. So if you ever travel out of the country, only use your face. Don't use any gestures. You might accidentally do something that's disrespectful. Even blind children who've never seen a face have similar facial expressions as others for their emotions. So again, this is another piece of evidence that facial expressions are universal. Universal. Because even blind children have them. They've never seen a face, and yet still when they're happy, they smile. When they're sad, they frown. Universal. Common to all people. The evolutionary take on this, the reason that it is the way it is, evolutionarily speaking, is potentially because before our ancestors communicated in words, they could only communicate, any important information, threats, greetings, submission, with facial expressions. So it was adaptive to express facial expressions like other people did, so that they understood and could relate to you. Emotional expressions can enhance our survival in other ways. I think this is so interesting. Surprise raises the eyebrows and widens the eyes, which allows us to take in more information. And when we're disgusted, we wrinkle the nose, which closes it off from foul odors. Kind of cool. And that's kind of another piece of evolutionary information, like why the facial expressions we have are the way that they are in response to different emotions. Context is a part of our judgment of emotions. So if we see an angry face in a frightening situation, we're actually more likely to think that face is looking fearful rather than angry. Whereas if we put that same angry face in like an MMA ring, then now we're going to perceive it as anger, right? The expressions associated with emotions are universal. Like I said, the expressions, your facial expressions. But the amount of emotion that one displays is partly a product of their culture. So everyone smiles when they're happy, but how much you smile can be a cultural difference. People tend to smile more in the US than they smile in Europe. That's a cultural difference. But, regardless, when Europeans are happy, they're going to smile. When Americans are happy, they're going to smile. It's just how long do they smile? How widely do they smile? Are they showing teeth? Right? Things like that. Last slide. Okay, expressions don't just communicate emotion, they also amplify and regulate your emotion, and this is what we call the facial feedback effect. And so this is just the idea that if you smile, you feel happier. If you furrow your brow and scowl, you'll feel angrier. So whatever your facial muscles are doing, it actually triggers your brain to believe that that's the emotion that you're experiencing, because emotion and facial expression are linked so very closely that it's not just that emotion leads to facial expression, but in fact it's a positive feedback loop, and that activating facial muscles will actually also increase your mood or increase your emotion in some type of way. When we're happy, we smile. When we smile, we become happier. This is so interesting. Botox paralysis of the frowning muscles actually slows people's reading of sadness and anger-related sentences, and it slows the activity in their emotion-related brain circuits. So when you lose the ability to express an emotion with your face, you actually become less and less emotionally literate. You become less and less able to detect emotions in other circumstances too. Interesting. And then we've got the behavior feedback effect. So I would say the behavior feedback effect is like an overarching category, and facial feedback is a type of behavior feedback. But when we're talking about behavior feedback effect, we're not going to be talking about facial expressions. We're going to be talking about anything else. So one example would be if you stand up tall and you put your chest out and your shoulders backwards, that makes you feel more confident. Whereas if you slouch, if you're kind of walking over, looking down at the ground, slouching, you actually can make yourself feel insecure or sad. So that fact that whatever your behavior is going to influence then your thoughts, your feelings, actions, emotions. And lastly, you can increase empathy by mimicking the facial expressions of others, meaning that you can feel how they feel by acting how they act. That's kind of an implication of the behavior feedback effect. So, all right, that is all. Make sure to submit the worksheet and take the quiz on Canvas as well. And then tomorrow is the last day to submit. So tomorrow being Tuesday, March 31st, is the last day to submit any of your worksheets for attendance credit, as I'm going to be sending out the test review on Wednesday, April 1st. So make sure that you get these in, get them done. But yeah, turn in the worksheet and take the quiz on Canvas. And I'll see you next time.